I was called a remnant and sent to boarding school when the golden child was born. What happened next was shocking. I grew up surrounded by wealth, but devoid of warmth, a life where appearances mattered more than affection. My parents, Christopher and Caroline Hastings, were fixtures of San Francisco's elite. Their sprawling mansion, perched high on the hills with its white columns and manicured lawns, was a symbol of their status. Inside, it was a showcase of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rooms that seemed designed for magazine spreads rather than living. But beneath all the splendor, our family was fractured. My existence was never part of their plan. From the moment I was born, I was a mistake, a glaring deviation from the perfect life they had envisioned. My parents dreamed of 2 daughters, a picture-perfect family, and I was the unwelcome glitch in that fantasy. Their disappointment wasn't hidden. It lived in their eyes every time they looked at me, a shadow that followed me through my childhood. I learned early on that love and acceptance weren't guaranteed, not even from those who were supposed to give them freely. My parents were polite in public, as appearances demanded, but behind closed doors, their indifference was suffocating. I overheard them once, when I was 5, arguing in hushed but sharp tones. My mother's voice, trembling with frustration, accused my father of failing her. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she'd hissed. "We weren't supposed to be that family." They hadn't planned for a son, and I was a constant reminder of how their perfect picture had cracked. When I was 6, their dream began to realign. After countless visits to fertility clinics and more hormonal injections than I could count, my mother announced she was pregnant again. This time it was different. This baby would be their golden child, their chance to rewrite the narrative. For the first time in my life, my mother smiled with genuine joy. Only it wasn't for me. She stopped looking at me altogether, her focus consumed by the baby she carried. When my sister Isabella was born, it was as if the world shifted. She was everything they had hoped for. The air in our house seemed to hum with the excitement of her presence. Every coo, every giggle from her was met with applause and adoration. Milestones became grand events. My parents celebrated her every breath, while I became little more than a shadow in the background. By the time Isabella came home from the hospital, my parents had already decided I no longer fit into their perfect image. They sent me away to Northwood Academy, an exclusive boarding school in Vermont. On paper, it was a prestigious opportunity, but in reality, it was their way of getting rid of me. With Isabella now fulfilling their dreams, they didn't need me around to disrupt the picture-perfect family they were building. Northwood Academy was beautiful, a fortress for the elite, with sprawling libraries and manicured gardens. But for me, it was a gilded cage. The other students came from privilege, but unlike me, they carried the assurance that they were loved and wanted. They sensed my vulnerability immediately. It didn't take long for them to label me the unwanted child, the mistake. Their taunts were sharp and relentless, and I had no one to turn to. My parents visited once a year, out of obligation, but their presence only deepened the ache. They'd ask about my grades, mention Isabella's latest accomplishments, and leave without so much as a lingering hug. The only solace I found during those years came from my Uncle David. My father's younger brother, David, was everything my parents weren't. He worked in a modest automotive factory in Oakland, far from the glitz and glamour of San Francisco. David wasn't wealthy, but he was present. He showed up when no one else did, taking me to baseball games or out for burgers, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. His life was simple but genuine, and I envied the peace he seemed to carry. By the time I graduated, I had hardened myself to the indifference of my parents. They provided financially, but emotionally, I was on my own. I decided to attend the London School of Economics, not just for the prestige, but to put an ocean between me and the family that had never wanted me. They didn't fight my decision. In fact, I think they were relieved. My father wired the money for tuition and expenses without so much as a question, and my mother seemed happy to focus solely on Isabella's glittering future. In London, I found a fresh start. The city was vast and indifferent, a perfect mirror for how I felt inside. At LSE, I buried myself in my studies, determined to succeed on my terms. I didn't need their love or approval anymore. Or so I thought. But as the years passed, the scars of my childhood lingered. Even thousands of miles away, my parents' voices echoed in my mind. Their rejection had shaped me, and no amount of distance or achievement could completely silence it. I had escaped their physical presence, but the weight of being unwanted clung to me like a shadow, always reminding me of where I came from. The distance from my family, both physical and emotional, became a convenient arrangement for everyone involved. My parents could maintain the illusion of a united, loving family while keeping me at arm's length. Meanwhile, I could focus on building a future for myself, far away from the suffocating expectations and indifference of a Hastings household. Studying at the London School of Economics, LSE, was everything I had hoped for. The city buzzed with energy, the people were diverse and ambitious, and the opportunities seemed endless. It was the perfect place to reinvent myself, to leave behind the label of unwanted son, and prove that I could succeed on my own terms. I chose to study brokerage and finance, not because I was passionate about the world of high-stakes money, but because I wanted to secure my independence. Success would be my shield against ever needing anything from my parents again. But LSE came with its own challenges. The British elite had their own rules, their own subtle hierarchies, and they were quick to remind anyone who didn't fit that they didn't belong. My American accent and outsider status made me an easy target. Sons of aristocrats and old money families made snide comments, mocking my every move. Their jabs were understated but pointed, designed to make me feel like an imposter in their world. It was different from the outright bullying I had endured at boarding school, but the sting was the same. Still, I refused to let their condescension break me. I had grown up as an outsider in my own family. This was just another version of the same script. The plan I had in my head kept me going: succeed, build my wealth, and ensure I would never have to look back. Not everyone at LSE was a gatekeeper to old money. I found allies in people like Tom, a sharp and driven guy from Toronto, who shared my ambition. Like me, Tom wasn't born into the British aristocracy, and he too understood the value of grit. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared goal of making it big without having to rely on inherited privilege. Together, we began laying the groundwork for our future. We spent countless nights brainstorming, sketching out ideas for our own brokerage firm. New York became our beacon, the city where the real money was, and where the competition would be toughest. To prepare, we infiltrated the elite clubs of London. The Civil Club, the Reform Club, places steeped in tradition and exclusivity. We weren't there to rub shoulders or make friends. We were there to observe, to learn how the wealthy operated, how they moved their money, and how they maintained their empires. Gaining access wasn't easy, but we worked our way in, first as guests and eventually as regulars. We became invisible in a way that allowed us to blend into their world, making connections with hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and real estate moguls. Slowly, we built a network of potential clients, people who might one day trust us with their fortunes. By my final year, our vision for the future was taking shape, and something unexpected happened. I met Emily. She was a fellow student in economics, from a modest middle-class family in Manchester. Unlike most of the people I had encountered, she wasn't interested in appearances or pedigree. Emily saw me for who I was and didn't treat me as an outsider. For the first time in years, I felt like someone truly understood me. Emily, Tom, and I became a trio, spending our last year at LSE mapping out the blueprint for our brokerage firm. We pooled every penny from our internships, cutting corners, and saving wherever we could to amass $250,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to get us started. We named the firm Evergreen Capital, a nod to stability and growth, the kind of image that would attract high-net-worth clients. As I prepared to leave for New York, the rare interactions I had with my family back in San Francisco only reinforced why I needed to stay away. My parents continued their indifference, their communications limited to mandatory invitations to family events. Isabella, their golden child, had grown into everything they wanted: a prodigy in ballet, piano, and academics. She thrived on their adoration and took every opportunity to remind me of my inadequacy. The last time I saw her before moving to New York was at one of my parents' charity galas. It was the kind of event where Isabella shone brightest, her charm effortlessly captivating the crowd. I stood in the background, counting the minutes until I could leave. At one point, she approached me, her perfect smile hiding a sharp edge. She leaned in close and said in a saccharine tone, "You know they only invited you to fill out the family photo." Her words cut deeper than I expected. It was a reminder that, to them, I wasn't a person, I was a prop. That was the moment I knew I was done playing the role of the unwanted son. I was leaving, and I wasn't looking back. Leaving the gala that night felt like crossing a threshold I could never return from. I booked a flight back to London, leaving behind not only the party, but the family that had never truly been mine. By the time the plane landed, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. My future lay ahead, with no room for ghosts from the past. When we graduated, Tom, Emily, and I moved to New York, ready to make Evergreen Capital a reality. Our first office was modest, a cramped space in Midtown with just enough room for a few desks and computers, but it was ours. We worked tirelessly, leveraging every connection we'd cultivated and every ounce of knowledge we'd gleaned from the elite circles we'd observed in London. The competition in the city was fierce, with legacy firms controlling most of the market, but we were determined to find our place. The first year was a trial by fire. We worked long hours, often 7 days a week, juggling endless client meetings, cold calls, and research. Every client we landed felt like a hard-won victory. We started with smaller hedge funds and boutique firms, clients who were overlooked by larger financial institutions but still needed a personalized approach. Slowly, our reputation grew. Evergreen Capital wasn't just surviving, it was finding its footing. While the business was taking shape, so was my personal life. Emily wasn't just my partner in the firm, she became my partner in life. She saw past the walls I had built and the scars I carried, making me feel, for the first time, like I was truly understood. With her and Tom, I felt like I had a family of my choosing, one that cared for me not out of obligation but out of genuine love and respect. As Evergreen Capital gained momentum, my parents remained a distant specter in my life. They would send occasional updates about Isabella, as if to remind me of her endless string of accomplishments. It was clear they wanted me to know that she remained their golden child, the star of the family. I no longer felt the sting of their comparisons. Their attempts to tether me to their world were nothing more than background noise. Evergreen Capital outgrew our tiny Midtown office within 2 years. We moved into a sleek space in a high-rise with panoramic views of Manhattan, a far cry from our humble beginnings. We were landing larger clients, old money families with multi-generational wealth, institutional investors seeking fresh perspectives, even a few high-profile celebrities. We weren't the biggest firm in New York, but we had carved out a niche, and I was proud of what we'd built. Despite my focus on the future, the past wasn't done with me yet. It started with a phone call from my Uncle David. His voice was weaker than usual, but he brushed off my concern, saying he was just tired from work. I didn't push, chalking it up to the long hours he always put in at the factory. A month later, the truth came crashing down. A call from his workplace informed me that David had collapsed on the job and been rushed to the hospital. Dropping everything, I flew to Oakland, desperately hoping it was nothing serious. But the reality was far grimmer. David had been battling stage 4 cancer. He'd known for months, maybe longer, but had chosen to keep it to himself, continuing to work and live life on his terms. He hadn't wanted to burden anyone, not even me. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. David was unconscious, hooked up to machines that were keeping him alive. The doctors told me he had refused treatment, opting to live the time he had left without being tethered to hospital beds and medical regimens. Sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, I felt a wave of guilt and helplessness. I should have noticed something was wrong. I should have pushed harder when his voice sounded off. But David was independent to a fault, and even in his final moments, he had chosen his own path. David passed away the next day. His funeral was small, attended by a handful of friends and coworkers. My parents didn't come, and I hadn't expected them to. They hadn't seen him in years, and likely wouldn't have cared even if they had. But standing there, surrounded by people who respected him for the life he had lived, I realized just how much he had meant to me. David was the only person who had ever shown me unconditional love, who had been there for me when no one else was. Losing him felt like losing the last true connection I had to any kind of family. After the funeral, I discovered that David had left everything he had to me. It wasn't much, his modest apartment, a small amount of savings, and a few personal belongings, but it meant the world to me. Even in his final days, he had thought of me, ensuring that I knew I wasn't alone. I returned to New York carrying a heavy heart, but also a renewed sense of purpose. David's life, simple and unassuming, had taught me the value of integrity and the importance of being true to oneself. Evergreen Capital was thriving, and I had built a life that was mine, but now I was determined to honor David's memory by living not just for success, but for meaning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I was walking it on my own terms. It wasn't the money or the estate that mattered most. It was the vindication, the knowledge that my uncle had trusted me, valued me, and seen me as his family, something my parents never did. For a while, I threw myself into work, burying my grief under the relentless grind of Evergreen Capital. But life wasn't done testing me, and the next blow came from a direction I should have anticipated but didn't. Caroline Hastings, my mother, had always been the mastermind of our family. While my father was the public face of their power, she was the one pulling strings behind the scenes with a precision that bordered on terrifying. I had always sensed her cold, calculating nature, but now she wielded it directly against me. A few weeks after David's funeral, I received a formal letter from my parents' lawyer. They were contesting my uncle's will. The claim was that David had been mentally unfit when he wrote the will and that his assets should rightfully go to them. I was stunned. My parents had shown zero interest in David's life or well-being for years, and now they were shamelessly trying to take the one thing he had left me. It wasn't about the money. They didn't need it. It was about control, about punishing me for succeeding without them. As the weeks passed, the truth behind their legal maneuver became clear. My mother had orchestrated the entire scheme. To her, I wasn't just the unwanted child anymore. I was a threat. I had built a life independent of them, a success story without their money or approval, and she couldn't stand it. In her twisted mind, I needed to be put back in my place. The legal battle that followed was brutal. My parents had the best lawyers money could buy, armed with every dirty trick in the book. They painted me as an ungrateful son who had abandoned his family, accusing me of manipulating David into leaving me his estate. It was a web of lies, but in the world of litigation, resources often outweighed the truth. Emily and Tom rallied around me, standing by my side as we hired our own legal team. The cost was steep, but I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about David's estate. It was about standing up to my parents, about refusing to let them erase the only family member who had ever cared about me. The fight dragged on for months, each round more exhausting than the last. As if the legal battle weren't enough, my parents turned their sights on Evergreen Capital. They began leveraging their influence in the financial world to spread rumors about the firm, casting doubt on our legitimacy. It was insidious and cruel, but it was classic Caroline Hastings. She wanted me to fail, to crawl back to them defeated and desperate for forgiveness. Instead of breaking, we doubled down. Emily spearheaded a PR campaign to counteract the rumors, ensuring our clients knew the truth. We refused to stoop to their level, but we worked tirelessly to rebuild and strengthen our reputation. Slowly, our hard work began to pay off, and the confidence we had lost in the market returned. And then Isabella, my sister, entered the fray. Groomed from birth to be the perfect daughter, she mirrored my parents' disdain for me. Taking to social media, she posted thinly veiled accusations of family betrayal, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of a sick relative. The posts were vicious, spreading like wildfire and tarnishing my name further. We had no choice but to escalate our PR efforts, working to share my side of the story. I refused to engage directly with Isabella's lies, knowing that doing so would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, we focused on the truth. David had left his estate to me because I was the only family who had been there for him. Through it all, Emily was my anchor. She worked tirelessly alongside me, not just in managing Evergreen Capital, but in helping me weather the storm. Late nights in the office became the norm as we strategized both our legal moves and our business plans. Her unwavering support kept me grounded when I felt like I was drowning. Finally, after months of legal sparring, the case went to court. My parents' legal team threw everything they had at us, but in the end, the evidence was clear. The judge upheld David's will, ruling in my favor. It was a victory, but it felt bittersweet. I had fought for David's legacy and won, but the toll on my spirit was heavy. Even as I walked out of the courtroom, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents wouldn't simply fade into the background. They had the resources, the influence, and the bitterness to keep coming for me. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of peace, a brief reprieve to focus on what truly mattered. Evergreen Capital was thriving. Despite the sabotage attempts, we had tripled our client base and grown our assets under management to nearly $500 million. Tom and I were exploring expansion plans for a second office in Chicago, while Emily was leading negotiations with a major European investment fund. We were carving out a place in the financial world, not as outsiders, but as trailblazers. As I stood in our sleek Manhattan office, overlooking the skyline, I felt a mixture of pride and resolve. My parents might still be out there, plotting their next move, but I wasn't the boy they had dismissed and discarded anymore. I had built a life, a legacy, and a future. Whatever came next, I was ready. The call from the SEC hit like a thunderbolt, marking the beginning of a storm I hadn't anticipated. Evergreen Capital, the firm I had poured my heart and soul into, was suddenly under scrutiny. The investigation centered on allegations of insider trading, a charge so devastating it could destroy not just a company, but an entire career. Initially, I was convinced it was a mistake. We had always prioritized compliance, hiring top-tier compliance officers, conducting regular audits, and ensuring every transaction was above board. There wasn't a single corner of our operations that hadn't been triple-checked for legality and ethicality. But the investigation wasn't a mistake. It was real, and the weight of the accusation loomed over us like a storm cloud. The SEC had acted on an anonymous tip claiming Evergreen Capital had leveraged non-public information from one of our clients, a prominent tech CEO, to gain an unfair advantage. The allegation was absurd, but its mere existence was enough to tarnish our reputation. In our industry, even whispers of impropriety could be catastrophic. It didn't take long for me to suspect the true culprits behind this orchestrated attack. The fingerprints of my parents were all over it. My father, though publicly the face of Hastings Financial, was a blunt instrument. My mother, Caroline, was the true strategist, the mastermind behind every move. The anonymous tip, it turned out, had come from one of their longtime legal allies, someone they had clearly coerced into feeding false information to the SEC. This was a deliberate strike, carefully timed and executed to dismantle what I had built. The fallout was immediate. Our clients, understandably cautious, began pulling their accounts, fearing the potential backlash of associating with a firm under federal investigation. New investors who had been on the cusp of committing to us suddenly went silent, unwilling to take the perceived risk. Rumors began circulating in financial circles, rumors that painted me as reckless, unethical, a rogue trader willing to gamble his clients' trust for personal gain. My parents had weaponized their influence and resources against me, sowing doubt and distrust in the industry I had painstakingly worked my way into. As if the investigation weren't enough, Hastings Financial announced their latest move, a high-profile expansion into the brokerage sector. They unveiled plans for a boutique firm, a direct competitor to Evergreen Capital, marketing themselves as the clean, trusted alternative to our beleaguered company. The timing couldn't have been more calculated. While we were bogged down by the investigation, they were swooping in to siphon off our clients, promising them stability and integrity. It was a move straight out of my mother's playbook, ruthless, precise, and effective. The attacks from my family weren't limited to the business world. They extended into the public sphere as well. Isabella, ever the perfect daughter and loyal extension of my parents' will, began a campaign on social media. Her posts were carefully crafted, filled with vague accusations of family betrayal and insinuations that I had manipulated a sick relative to gain an inheritance. It was a smear campaign designed to erode my credibility not just in the industry, but in the eyes of anyone who had ever known me. It was working. The whispers of doubt that had dogged me since childhood resurfaced, amplified by Isabella's reach and my parents' resources. The combined weight of the investigation, the public attacks, and the loss of clients was almost too much to bear. Evergreen Capital, the dream I had built with Emily and Tom, was crumbling under the pressure. But just when the situation seemed hopeless, Tom came to me with a lifeline. He had been quietly forging relationships with a new wave of tech entrepreneurs, many of whom were heavily invested in cryptocurrency. These were people who didn't play by the old rules, who didn't care about legacy institutions or old money. They valued innovation, agility, and boldness, the very qualities Evergreen Capital had in abundance. One of these connections was with Liam Harris, a crypto billionaire looking for a brokerage firm capable of handling the volatility of his portfolio. Tom proposed a pivot, something radical and risky, but necessary. Instead of competing head-to-head with Hastings Financial in the traditional markets, we would pivot to the future, focusing on cryptocurrency, fintech, and high-growth assets. It was a gamble that could either save us or end us entirely, but we didn't have the luxury of playing it safe. Emily, though initially hesitant, understood the stakes. The old Evergreen Capital was under siege, and if we didn't evolve, we would be crushed. Together, we rebranded the firm, positioning ourselves as a forward-thinking, tech-savvy alternative to the traditional brokerage model. The transition wasn't easy, but it paid off. Within months, we secured several high-profile clients, including Liam Harris, whose wealth alone provided the stability we desperately needed. The pivot not only saved Evergreen Capital, but propelled us into a new era of growth. We became leaders in the emerging financial frontier, carving out a niche where Hastings Financial couldn't follow. Their rigid, traditional approach left them ill-equipped to compete in the fast-paced world of crypto and fintech, and their attempts to replicate our success fell flat. Eventually, the SEC cleared us of all charges. Their investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing, confirming what we had known all along. The allegations were baseless. By the time the ruling came, we had already moved on, thriving in our new market and leaving the shadow of the investigation behind us. My parents were livid. They had tried everything: legal maneuvers, public smears, corporate sabotage, and they had failed. They had underestimated me, just as they always had, and now they were left to watch as Evergreen Capital flourished in a space they couldn't touch. The victory wasn't just professional, it was personal. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Free from the shadow of my parents, free from the whispers of doubt that had followed me for years, free to build a life on my own terms. Evergreen Capital wasn't just a company. It was proof that I could succeed without them, that I was capable of thriving despite their efforts to destroy me. The battle with my parents wasn't over, not really. I knew they would find new ways to interfere, to undermine me. But for now, I had something they couldn't take away: the knowledge that I had fought back and won. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it, not as their son, but as my own person.